Hi,
Good.
everyone. Hi, Bill, and welcome to this installment of our monthly interview series, Conversations with Bill. I'm Laura Yaverbaum, a very proud graduate of the MS HFID program at Bentley, and I'm very honored to be a part of this series, which is dedicated to capturing Bill's incredible legacy before his retirement. Each month, a different HFID advisory board member from the program will sit down with Bill to discuss a topic related to his journey and his immense impact on the field of human factors and information design. So in line with that, today I'll be asking Bill to share his thoughts on bridging the gap between industry and academia. So Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Lori. I think the great part of this is not only having a chance to share, but getting to spend, time with each of you. It's been a real pleasure over the last 7 or 8 months.
Yeah, I have loved watching all the videos so
Mhm.
far, and I'm excited for today. So I'll just start off by asking you a question about your career and working at the intersection of industry and academia. In your view, what do you think is the biggest gap between the two, and why do you think this is important for students to understand?
Yeah, I think, the biggest gap between the two is again is kind of the foundational perspective on the discipline. I think when you're in the world of work, and again, the discipline came out of the world of work. I think about it, I was doing the consulting before I started building programs. And it was the same thing with there were probably 10 or 15 of us doing it at the time in the early 80s. And we were all doing the same thing. And we figured out how do you capture this? Rather than every assignment becoming, a new problem that you have to just approach it from scratch all over again. How do you lay that foundation? How do you lay that basis? So that you approach each new thing, leveraging the learnings from the past. And I think that's what the academic world does is it captures that and it codifies that to the best of your ability. There's always going to be something unique in every problem, but with time and even when you move across products and industries and user populations, there is a consistency, there's a constancy. And I think that's that was lacking, particularly in the early days, lacking in professional practice within the industry. And I think that's what, the academic world needed to build.
Okay, great. And I agree. So in your
Well,
in
and it's motivation too. I mean, I get it. This is not a criticism of and you know this. You live it every day. Is you've got to get the work done, and we have a luxury in the academic world to be able to think about things, more deeply and more broadly. So we understand, and this is why at the end of the day, the partnership makes it work.
Yeah, and I love that intersection. I think I've said this many times. I would go to class and the next day I would apply something that I
Yeah.
learned at work. So when you were talking with Anne in one of the previous interviews on your principles that stand the test of time, you spoke a bit about your foundations class and how it teaches people to find the right research and information that is needed for a particular scenario. And I thought that was a super interesting takeaway that I hadn't really consciously processed while I was taking the class. But can you talk a little bit more about this and maybe some other strategies that you put into place so that students could gain like a really strong academic foundation, but also with hands-on real world experience?
Yeah, and it's part of that divide that we were just talking about between the professional world and the academic world. And I think even within the academic world, we have divisions. I think what sets our program apart, and it's, I think it's the foundations course, but I think, again, we have a foundations course, and I say the equivalent, and that's the way we thought about the program design. There's a foundations course in design, and there's a foundations course in research practices. And as a excuse me, a foundations course in strategy and management. So was laying that foundation. So 700 was the behavioral, but then what is the basic solid foundation you have in research, design, and management and strategy. And I think that's the unique thing about our program. I don't think other academic programs have done that. I think some of them, and some of the better ones are very good on the theory side, but they haven't dealt with it comprehensively like we have in the program. And and this has come up in other interviews as well, so I won't linger on it. But in my closing days here, this is where, and I don't say this in a mean-spirited way, but I've begun to question. And I think anybody who's come through this program, it is a profession, but every profession has this kind of foundation that they build on. And for some reason, our field over the last 30 years has never built out that foundation. I've worked on common bodies of knowledge projects in the field, many times, I should well, probably 3 or 4 times over the last 30 years, and every one of them has been abandoned. So we can't even agree on what the foundation looks like. And I think the one thing that we should be proud of in the program, and the students help shape this because every one of the courses has been shaped by the students over the years, is we've settled on a solid foundation in each of those areas. And yes, it's changed as the populations have changed and technology has changed, and the introduction of different modalities have changed. We've constantly modified, but it's always been built on that foundation, and we don't see that. We don't see that, I think, in practice, and I don't think we see that in many other academic programs either. So, again, at the end of the day, for foundations, just going back to the original and really driving that point home. I have a biased position here, but I don't know how you can do research or interaction design without a deep understanding of human behavior. And if anything, what's happened over the years is I think there's a deeper need at this moment in time, simply because the easy stuff is going to go away. I mean, I think that's going to be a shift that we see. Some of the easy stuff is going to be handled by AI. There's no doubt about it. And it's gonna move upstream too over time as well as it gets better. But the really hard, messy problems really require that incredibly deep understanding. And that's what the academic world brings. And it's really hard. It's really hard for the industry to do that. Now, every academic program, I think, has a responsibility for doing that, but it hasn't happened widespread.
Yeah, I talked to my team about that a lot, and I think what I see is a lot of applicants coming in with a visual design background that don't understand all of those foundational principles, and I love that we were able to learn that in the Bentley program.
Yeah, and I've seen both sides of it because, I can remember my early studio classes as an undergrad. We weren't taught this. And I know when I left that program and I started teaching at the University of Maryland and I was teaching, studio classes, I didn't teach it then. It was only in my graduate studies where I really became, curious about the intersection of people and their perceptual systems and their cognitive systems and the things that we design and create, that I began to bring it into my teaching.
Yeah, and I think from a business perspective, there's no stronger argument against someone's opinion than, that type of
That's
factual
exactly it. I
understanding.
mean, so whether it be, coming up against a product owner who's very opinionated and very strong-willed, or whether it be the engineer that we encounter quite frequently who always knows what's best. Again, they're not equipped and they're not armed to counter these kinds of, behaviorally based, scientifically based arguments.
Yeah, and I also love the amount of time you can save, like just in understanding that when you sit down to first, to that blank screen of I'm going to design something. It's like I already know all of this.
Well, yeah, and again, I think what again, I think back always like to the first night of class in 700 as the simplest model I give you is just thinking about people as being made up of strengths and limitations. And you play to the strengths and you avoid the limitations. And when you can't avoid them, then you have to build in, performance support and design support. It's the most basic way to approach design.
How about a memorable example of how integrating industry projects or perspectives into the classroom made a lasting impression on a student's learning career, a student's learning or their career direction?
Yeah, and a couple come to mind, and they're ones I've mentioned in past episodes, but I'm going to repeat them because I think it says a lot about the people that we attract to this program. I've been very fortunate to have worked with just incredible students over, the last 26 years. And I think we attract a special kind of person. Really, really do I get somebody who comes in and says, I want to work for this company and make a ton of money. I think everybody wants to, they want to be successful, of course, but I think they really want to bring value to people's lives. And I think we see this in the examples that I'm going to give you. It's not going to be an internship. I got somebody at Google or Tesla or something along those lines, or even Fidelity, sorry. Those are not the ones I think that people will come back to 10, 15 years later and talk to me about. It's really going to be the ones where they've worked with not-for-profits. So whether it be the one, over the last 6 years, working with the court system in the state of Massachusetts. And really where they literally have affected, the way the courthouses are designed. There's actually, a Bentley research project done by our students that's now in case law. It was cited in a judge's ruling for returning a child back to his mother. And they literally cited, the Bentley, HFID research project and of talking about some of the accessibility obstacles that were present in the original, hearing. So things like that, where they're working with, designing a more inclusive world, a more accessible world. Again, helping again the digital divide that we have now as marginalized populations, where people might have cognitive impairments. They might, language might not be, English might not be their primary language. They may be poor, they may be illiterate, but again, giving them fair access to the legal system. Another project, there's been several of these with Children's Hospital. We've had, great partnerships with Children's Hospital over the year. But again, where, they worked with, chronically ill children. Particularly there was one project during COVID, the isolation that these poor children, again, human contact it has healing power. And they lost that during COVID. So, the students did research and they had to do it all remotely and all of this. But that is a project, again, students have worked on those kinds of projects, will talk to me about them 10 years later. And the last one that I just love, and I think about it a lot today because there's sad things going on there. But after the earthquake in Haiti, God, I lose track of time, how many years ago it was, but it was a lot of years ago. The hospital was destroyed, and we partnered with Partners in Health here in Boston, and they rebuilt the hospital down there. But then they discovered that they were still using papered records. So the HFID program built an electronic health record, and then it was engineered by students at Harvard, and it's still being used in Haiti today, in Port-au-Prince, and this past year, it was, and I'm blanking on the country right now, but it's now being used in a country in Africa with cultural modifications. So again, where the students have really changed people's lives, they've saved people's lives. They've allowed people again to have that fair and equal access to the legal system where they're so disadvantaged. Those are the things they remember. And that's what user experience design is all about.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, yeah, in a business world and when you get into the for-profit world, it's about, bottom line and affecting the bottom line and quantifying how you affect the bottom line. But it's wonderful to be in this world where you can really focus on the things I think that motivate all of us the most.
Yes, I agree. Okay, and my last question that I have is if you were speaking to educators who wanted to make their curriculum more relevant to today's experience design landscape, what kind of guidance would you offer?
Yeah, and it goes back to you and I talked about it and modified it a little bit in the beginning here, but it really you have to. So I think we've kind of leaned into the academic side, but I think my job has always been to maintain a balance, and I think that's the art. is maintaining the balance, and it gets out of whack every once in a while, and you have to shift it back. But we just can't be in a theoretical bubble. So we've got to take that and we need to, connect it to professional practice. And then even there, you have to connect it to the practice in the here and now, what they're going to be doing in their first job out of the program so that they're successful. But this is what education does that industry, and I say struggles with, but rightly so. I mean, they have to focus on the here and now. It's the nature of their world. But we're educating people for a career, for I say for a lifetime. And I'm thrilled that, when I talk to people who graduated, 24, 25 years ago, that they still feel that their education is relevant today, even though that the program has changed pretty dramatically. And I think that's what we're doing is we want to educate people in such a way that they're successful in the here and now, immediately out of the gate, but they're equally successful 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the road. And I think that's the advice that I would give to other programs is how do you do that? And how do you do that? And how do you convince the students that that's important? Because everybody, wants to get that first job. I mean, that's what they're focused on. They're focused on that first job. So our job is to make sure if we didn't tell them we were going to do that, we would never attract them to the program, of course. But then how do we convince them that this is important? And it's hard to think ahead and say, like, this is going to be important. What we're asking you to do today is going to be important 25 years ago, because that's just not the way people think. They live in the here and now and that immediate gratification. So how do you maintain that balance? How do you maintain that balance that you focus on what the industry wants today, but kind of looking at where things are going? And so right now, we're looking at, I think, the things that we've been shifting towards over the last, probably the first thing that we started shifting is in our research to be more quantitatively oriented. We saw that long before it happened. There's a group of students out there that are going to listen to this to remember. I lose track of time, but 15 years ago, we polled the students. We wanted to bring in a requirement for stats, and there was like a revolt. People were marching on my office with torches, and that didn't happen. But credit to students over time is I think they saw this on their own, and we gave them this option as an elective, and they saw that. But again, on the research side, moving towards that and some pretty serious stuff. I mean, Tom started us on this road, and I think we just keep taking it to higher and higher levels now, just because the needs are so much more sophisticated today. Then we saw this also with the technology, where again we knew the shift was going to be moving away from just the graphical user interface, the visual interface, even though it still dominates, but it's moving into a multimodal, immersive world. And so we've been started building out the curriculum there. We started hiring new people, with deep expertise in those areas. And you don't see that in other programs, not to the same extent that you have here, where we're able to balance that. And then I would say the most recent one is AI, and again, talking about it in every class in terms of how it's going to affect research, how it's going to affect design, how it's going to affect the profession as a whole, but then how do we use it as a tool in all of those areas as well? Because it is going to be a tool. It's not, it's so much more powerful, but it's not unlike, we were all freaking out about, user testing when it came along, when we were a program focused very much on lab-based, testing. All of that, no, I shouldn't say all of it, but most of that went away, and we're a better profession because of it. When you think about the hours we used to spend, editing tapes and things like that, 25 years ago, that's all gone. Nobody wanted to do that. So it's good to have that go away, but now a lot of that is being analyzed. Our transcripts are being analyzed, our recordings are being analyzed by AI, and every month, every week, it's getting better at it. So again, thinking about how we use it as a tool, and then what remains in terms of, I think the big conversation now is we're going to be a smaller profession. But I think we're going to be dealing with the most sophisticated, messy problems. The easy stuff is going to go away, and maybe that's a good thing. I'm not worried about that. And it's maybe not a bad thing that we're going to be a smaller profession, because again, we had such an influx over the last 10 years of poorly trained people. We all paid a price for that. We were all affected by this, and again, when you look at the layoffs that have happened over the last 2 years, good people got thrown out with the people who weren't properly trained. And so that's I don't mean to be unfeeling when I say this, but it's good for that to happen every once in a while in the field, particularly a field like ours that doesn't have certification, doesn't have accreditation like every other profession that we're dealing with. We almost have to have that cleaning of the house every once in a while or periodically, so that we get back to focusing on the quality things that we do.
Yeah, and I'm interested. First of all, I'm thinking I should go back through the program because it's probably
Well,
not a good
yeah, no, and
capacity.
this is where you turn it over. It's somebody new, and we have a great team that's taking over. But I would say, if you ask me about unfinished business, I think that's one of the things that's unfinished. Is we've wanted to for a long time, and you're not alone. I've heard from a lot of alums over the more than 10 years, is when they look at the program today, they say that it's so different than the one they went through. The good news is some of the things that we talked about before. I honestly believe there's probably a 50% base, that foundations in each of those areas that hasn't changed.
Mhm.
I think, in the first 10 years, we nailed it. We nailed it, and we nailed it with your help. Again, getting feedback and getting course correction and so on and so forth from you, and you meaning collectively the students, and the alumni. But I think it's sound, and so you're going to find that that hasn't changed, and we're applying some of that same thinking then to the new emerging technologies. But again, to have some kind of not a whole new program, but whether it be a grad certificate or a grad boot camp or something along those lines, or an executive, graduate program, where people can come back and say, okay, AI, going deeply there and multimodal, immersive design. How do I tool up in that area? I think there's really a need for doing that. I think there is a need for doing that.
I think my legacy with all of the people I've managed in the past is how much I don't like lines, like extra
Mhm.
lines on pages, and that's definitely from foundations.
Well, and it's just noise. Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think we learned, and again, I think we discuss in a lot of the classes, when people don't know, they overcompensate.
Hmm.
So it's just like, when somebody doesn't know how to write, they use too many words and too many sentences. And the same thing when you don't know how to design, you err on the side of caution and you build in too much redundancy and frames and lines and so on and so forth. And it's just compensating for the lack of not knowing. And I think the one thing about, all of you who come out of the program, and
Yeah.
you know the difference.
And I'll just ask you one last question before we wrap up. As all these new courses are coming into the program, is there courses that you see that are no longer relevant?
Yeah, we haven't, I don't think we've necessarily, I'm thinking back, and I think there's been a few, like some of our early ventures into AI. So again, everybody's talking about AI today, but we had an AI course 20 years ago. I mean, we called it intelligent user interface because back then AI was a dirty word, even
Yeah.
though it was used in the academic world, but everybody was frightened by artificial intelligence. So we called it intelligent user interfaces. And, we knew it was coming. I mean, we were way ahead of it, and building an expert in intelligence support and so on and so forth. But I don't think we ever got it quite right, and it's basically because we didn't have anything to check it against in industry, because it didn't take off the way we thought it would. That course has been modified a lot, so it's a new, almost built from the ground up course. I think there are some courses that are going to be interesting, kind of moving forward. Some of the things that we did, like where we used to have like accessibility courses, where we've now
Mhm.
integrated accessibility in other courses, and we feel it should be spread across the curriculum. maybe that'll happen around internationalization because I'm not sure what will happen to that course now with me retiring, and maybe it's better that it's integrated in other courses. But there are a few courses that have just been thrown out, and I feel good about that. I feel very good about that. Um, yeah, I really I don't think I can point to a course that has been eliminated completely. Some have been rebuilt from the ground up, but not eliminated completely.
All right. Well, I don't want to end on a negative note with courses being eliminated,
No,
but I
no,
think
no, 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 no. I
it's
mean, it's an
great to
important.
keep like
Yeah,
a refresh.
it's an important thing, and we're always judging that, and we're always assessing that, and thinking about what new things need to come into 700, what new things need to come into our strategy courses, how are we going to approach the emerging technologies and things like that. We have to be thinking about that, and again, always in the here and now, but also thinking about 5 years, 10 years out to the best of our ability, because this is what education is all about, is preparing people for the future. Yes, getting you that first job, but making sure that you're successful. And I think that's a legacy of the program is very few people. There's been a few, but very few people have dropped out of the field. When you think of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who've been through the program, there's very few people who have dropped out. And again, I'm always thinking like there's probably five people that come to mind immediately, and it's all because they went into meditation, yoga, or mindfulness. So it
Mm.
tells you about something that how the kinds of people that we attract to the program. So they're still doing it, but they're doing it in a different way. So yeah, again, I think that's a good thing that when you're thinking about the early grads that were coming out in the early 2000s and how different the tech world was at that
Mhm.
time. And those people have, their success has only grown, over that period of time. I think, again, first and foremost, we give credit to, recruiting really good students, really smart people, and really motivated people and passionate people. But also, I think the program did a good job educating them.
I wholeheartedly agree. Thank you. It's like a little emotional. I can't imagine how it is for you, but I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time and sitting down with me. This was the seventh installment of the monthly interview series, and there's still a couple more left through June. So hopefully people watching this can go back and look at some of the other ones and stay tuned for the new ones that'll be shared on the last day of every month on the LinkedIn Bentley HFID alum and student networking group pages. So thank you, Bill. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.